Hello, everyone. So welcome to the second edition of our book club for Discourse from Discord. Today we're going to be discussing the book Understanding Socialism, written by Richard Wolff.
Yes, I'm Michael Favada. This is Scout Hartley.
Oh, yeah.
We're excited to have our second episode here. Continuing the theme of socialism, this book is written by a single person, unlike the collection of essays we had reviewed before, Richard Wolff, who is really one of the most prominent Marxist socialist economists today. And with this book, he tries to give kind of a gentle introduction to socialism. I think the socialist section of the bookstore could be a little bit musty, be a little bit like clouded with all kinds of technical theory and internecine warfare between warring factions. And so this is trying to give a broad scope, like openness to a diversity of interpretations of what socialism is, you know, the Scandinavian side of it versus the complete command economy style side of it. Talk about the continuing failures of capitalism and why socialism has not been able to be stamped out. It's still vital in Wolff's eyes. And talk about the history and give a historical context with, in particular, China and the USSR's economies in the 20th century.
Yeah, and he chose those two models just because they're kind of like the archetypal models for, socialist or communist governments. And they're also the kind of first thing someone thinks about when they think of maybe a failed example, not even maybe, a failed example of socialism and communism in history. One of the things the book highlights really well is that kind of, the contemporary way of thinking about socialism is really just kind of the same specter of socialism that we saw throughout the Cold War and that kind of anti-communist ideology. And that really still kind of shapes the narrative today around socialism. It wasn't even something that I properly understood until, really when we started reading about it a little bit more. I think I had some fundamental understandings, but I didn't really have that context, which I got from this book. I think it was a really great introduction.
Yeah, and we're young people in 2020 in America, and that leaves inevitably a particular understanding or impression of socialism. It's not the same impression that a young person would have had in 1980, where it's more of a demonization. And things like Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders show that there's more curiosity, but still the residue of the 1950s Red Scare is still very much with us. And you learn the things you learn in high school that I haven't thought about in many years, about how, musicians and screenwriters and artists could have been jailed or blacklisted or just lost any contact with the profession. And even teachers would lose their jobs. And, no really books were on the bestseller list that were promoting or viewing as in any way palatable socialism. And that's a historical context that we still live with. So it's a new generation that Richard Wolff is speaking to that is more curious, but still the stains are there.
Yeah, no, they are there. And I think one thing that's really interesting is that, and he really kind of went to a length in this book to make it clear, like, a lot of the ways he necessarily felt that he had to describe his argument and describe socialism the way he did in this book because there's, such scant literature about the subject, but also because there really is, such ferocity against the theory and the concept. It's, and I think one thing that I really learned, or at least that it really reinforced throughout reading this, was that to use like a term, like a lot of, I think people's concerns are like a priori about socialism. I think it's not something that's well researched, at least in our knowledge base and what we can access in the United States, or kind of what's being written about, and it's also part of this deep narrative of our history. There's just a lot going on that kind of pose issues for learning about socialism, and I think that it's being truncated, in this really interesting way. He didn't. I kind of wish he talked about it in the book. He talked about it in a separate discussion, but just it was on Democracy Now. think it was Democracy Now. In any case, Richard Wolff talked about how socialism is really something that even in Harvard, when he was studying economics, he did not learn about. I think that speaks to something. One of many factors that kind of sets socialism up for failure in a way. And obviously, there are its own examples as well, failed models in the past. But
Yeah, and let's not forget that there are genuine crimes to atone for. Millions of lives lost under Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao.
mhm. And he
Wolf,
acknowledges that.
yes,
No,
I'm gonna.
maybe maybe a little lightly, but
Yes, I will give. I'll give a quote that he most directly addresses it. Maybe he says, "Quote: Stalin and Pol Pot are stains on the history of socialism that it must account for and reject. The Spanish Inquisition, missionaries' misdeeds, holy wars against infidels, and countless wars among different interpretations are parallel stains on Christianity. Centuries of colonialism, the slave trade, world war, and mass poverty in the midst of great wealth stain capitalism." So there he's really saying there's blame to go around everywhere. And so we shouldn't look too askance at socialism because it has these terrible things associated with it. I guess people will rebut that socialism is probably uniquely, there's two major examples of socialism in the 20th century, China and USSR, and they both had substantial human rights violations. So socialism doesn't have a great track record, but capitalism has taken a long time to get its act together as well. And there's pretty uniformly in early capitalism, there is brutal exploitation of workers, and colonialism was all the rage for centuries. So I don't know. What do you think of that?
well, the first thing I think is that capitalism doesn't really seem to be working now either. I think that's one of the points that he makes in the book is that, capitalism has shown us again that that it's a system that can fail as well. I think capitalism especially shows its ugliness when we think about, situations like, exploitive labor. One of the things that I found interesting in the book that he talked about was China. One of the things that helped the Chinese Communist government grow, under Mao, was that it was state capitalist in nature, but it still kind of took advantage of free market trade. And it took advantage, particularly, of its low cost labor. So this, and China is one example that is referred to in the book, but there are other examples as well. The situation in Bangladesh from years ago, where something, over 1,000 workers were killed in a factory, really because of just a heartless company that was part of a really large pattern of trade, and under the guise of a free market capitalist system. So I think that there's this really interesting kind of implicit bias that comes out when we make like anti-communist or anti-socialist arguments, or even skeptical arguments. Um, and the bias is that we don't tend to recognize um, the present failures and the past failures of the United States. I think it's just, I don't necessarily think it's that strong. Like, I think the United States is a powerful presence in the world nonetheless. I think, I'm an international liberal, to be clear, but, just for context.
Right. Yeah, and those are valid points, but there's always going to be the argument, and this is the common knock against socialism, that there's something incompatible with human nature about it, and that capitalism can be tempered and its problems can be overcome. We don't have the problem of slavery. We don't have as much of a problem with colonialism anymore. Is there something about socialism that is necessarily intertwined with these problems of austerity, problems of civil liberty, problems of corruption of leaders, autocrats not wanting to give up power, um, these
No,
issues?
valid. Though, it's definitely valid. I mean, um, I think that one thing that I heard in the book, and also in the previous book that we read, The ABCs of Socialism, is that, a lot of those positive moments in what we'll call capitalist history, or at least in the United States, were responsible because of grassroots socialist organizing. In the book, they refer to, the socialists part of the New Deal coalition, and how, FDR did not go into his presidency being a radical left Democrat, but he ended up becoming one because of the grassroots socialist movement that underpinned his campaign and his administration. In different examples with the civil rights movement and the labor rights movement, in the attempts to kind of demonstrate that, like we talked about in the previous podcast, that labor issues are class issues, are race issues, and that's really where socialism is kind of the unifying theory about all these things. At least you can think of it that way. Um, you know,
Yes.
and I think that though, for to the extent that those arguments are valid, and they certainly are, I think that we should look at, and he kind of alludes to this but doesn't explicitly go into it, but think about I'm such a loser, but administrative policy that underpins these governance systems. I think that that's the second part of this. That was something he alludes to in the book, the different administrative structures that supported and facilitated the growth and maintenance of the USSR, and the one of in the Chinese government. So I think that over time, if you can start to get those things, I mean, we have the benefit of history with us when thinking about capitalism, but if you start to think about what you can tweak internally to make the machine work, I think it can work. He proposes a different model for socialism, beyond the archetypes that we saw in the USSR and then China. So, I think that there's counter arguments for it, and I still have hope as well.
Yeah, the fundamental socialist impulse is one of hopefulness, and one of the impression that there's got to be a better way for society to organize itself. And it's a great point that that socialist instinct brought us the 5-day work week, the 8-hour work day, um, probably to some extent women's suffrage. Socialism has always been intertwined with with feminist movements, with
Hmm.
racial equality movements, these kinds of things. Um, I listened to a podcast recently, though, kind of hitting the same theme, with Naval Ravikant, who I think is an entrepreneur. But he referred to this quote. I think it's Churchill: "A young man is heartless if he is not a liberal, and an old man is brainless if he's not a conservative." And he was saying this same thing, that socialism really comes from the heart and capitalism comes from the head. Um, I don't know to what extent that's true. That's really the question we're debating. But Wolf makes an interesting case that capitalism is really broken in some core places. It has problems it cannot overcome. And that kind of attitude, the attitude that improving things on a fundamental basis is a doomed endeavor. You could cash that check at any time and we wouldn't have improved, right? So we always need to be pushing forward. But Wolff's fundamental critique of capitalism is that it hasn't broken from this fundamental master slave dynamic. He has this great way of making history a narrative, and different economic systems throughout history. You have slavery, which has the master slave relationship, feudalism, which has lords and serfs, monarchy has kings and subjects, and now capitalism has employer employee. And you have all of these parallel problems, that the dominant party is trampling over the rights of the non-dominant party and controlling them. And capitalism claims to have solved these issues by making it a free transaction, but it really hasn't. And we've seen threats to our democracy. We've seen the way in which the lower classes are not listened to on any policy issues, just general disenfranchisement. And that makes Wolff's case really compelling. And it's the reason that socialism has become more relevant to our dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that, I think talking about these economic systems, it kind of seems overgeneralizing, in my opinion. He does they do it in this. He did it in this book. They did it in the previous book, the ABCs of Socialism, referring to capitalism as kind of like this entity. Um, you know, and just kind of describe like using capitalism as also like a supplement for like our system of government, and similarly using socialism as a supplement for the system of government that existed in those prior regimes. I think that we can improve our capitalist system. I think our political system is broken, and I think the economic system undergirds that. I think it supports that. Um, I think it's an unfortunate thing that both our capitalist system has failed and our political system has failed, thereby necessitating a socialist revolution. Well, in my opinion, necessitating a socialist revolution. I am, I'm very persuaded by the ideology now. You know, but I think that it's not as if we were to adopt a socialist government that things would change because of socialism. They would change also because the way that we think about our economy changes, the way that our political regimes operate changes, all these different things. Society is a complex, so just that's my, I guess, like addition to that. But otherwise, I think those issues of capitalism are they reign true. It resonates with me. A lot of what was stated in this book resonates with me. So yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of, there's definitely, I'm relatively new to this, as are you. So I'm still sort of agnostic on a lot of these questions. And I think there are a lot of genuine problems for capitalism to solve. Another one is negative externalities. Businesses thrive and function by socializing externalities that are, passing on to the public, externalities that are negative to their business. If you have a chemical factory plant that is, polluting the air, and you give someone a lung infection or COPD or something, they're not paying for your doctor's visits. And so capitalist businesses function by kind of skirting these things. So how do we get rid of that under a pure capitalist system? We really don't, if we just leave it to the free market. So it does point to the necessity of some kind of mixed system, some kind of instinct towards
Mixed
uh,
system
socialism.
is a good way of putting it, because I think one thing that that I believed before reading the book and he reinforced for me is that like we talk about these concepts as if they're kind of like singular concepts, but you know even the prior socialism that he describes in his book, he describes in such a way as it being state capitalism. And I think that that's a description I've heard for China in its current state as well. So I'm persuaded by that description, and saying that, you know, none of this is a zero sum game. And it's not as if, you're all capitalism or no capitalism and all socialism and no socialism. You can have a little bit of both. One of the things he talks about throughout the book, and particularly the last chapter, is thinking about socialism not necessarily in this kind of way of like centralized planning that is traditionally thought of, but really putting the focus on changing the workplace, and addressing those kinds of concerns that you were just highlighting. That you know in this employer-employee regime, employees, really don't have the kind
Power.
of, benefit, power, um, buy-in, whatever you want to call it, that, and at the same time, the disparity between income is like so incredible. Like I think that that's the other
Yeah.
interesting dynamic here that that arguably necessitates some political movement. And I think it's a theme that he points out in the book as well. That the the economic crash, the recession of 2008, show really emboldened people and kind of reinvigorated this idea of socialism in American society.
Yes, that's a theme he hits a lot, and he calls it capitalist triumphalism. And there was this Francis Fukuyama's The End of History after the Soviet Union collapsed.
I was wondering who
Um,
wrote that book. I was just thinking about that book. Thank you for bringing that up.
yeah,
I wanted to
no
buy that
problem.
book recently because I heard him give a lecture on it and I thought it was so interesting.
Yeah, he's still around.
Yeah.
But that book probably hasn't aged well. The widespread consensus is that we're still very much living in history. And you had the Clinton years in America. You had a lot of the Thatcherite, Reaganite free market ideas still kind of reign supreme. Um, and so the idea was that socialism was dead and buried. And 2008 really um, taught us that that isn't the case. The kind of cyclical instability that has always plagued capitalism came back to bite it, and now we have uh, a group of young people who are more inclined towards socialism. So I wanted to kind of orient the conversation towards criticisms of capitalism, and I think those are damning ones.
Yeah.
Did you want to move in a different direction? I wanted to move towards criticism of socialism, but
Yeah, I just want to say real quick,
I'll leave this more to you.
this is a plague that also burdens socialism as well. He admits the failures of socialism. He says that socialism is part of an iterative process, just as capitalism is. So no one's free from the reality of life, that these, imperfection is prevalent, and making systems better is hard, and it takes a lot of time.
Yes. And this is something that I could see as partly a strength and partly a real weakness of socialism, is that it's kind of ill-defined. And he talks about the pre-1917 Russian Revolution idea of socialism was just like a whole bunch of intellectuals arguing. And you had the Paris Commune, Marx and Engels, um, the French Revolution, all these things were kind of precedents where there's something bubbling up that points to the inadequacy of capitalism and says that there might be some other way. But there was no one way. And then the USSR came onto the scene, and you had Lenin, and then Stalin. Lenin never said that they had reached socialism. I think it was the dictatorship of the proletariat still. According to Marx, it was going to proceed in stages. But then Stalin kind of ousted Lenin and said, no, we've achieved it. This is it. This is communism. And they kept the name socialism. Socialism is in their name. So you kind of had this multiplicity of interpretations that was whittled down to one, and that was one of the things that contributed to the difference in nomenclature between communists, which were Stalinists or defenders of the USSR, and then socialists were people that felt like maybe they've distorted or betrayed what socialism is supposed to mean. And China muddies the waters as well because it has a lot of interaction with foreign capitalism. And so it kind of has this fundamental position of trading cheap labor and access to the Chinese market for technology, and buying up all their stuff, buying their retail trade systems. So you really don't have any super clear definition of what socialism is. It's just a bunch of people fighting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting, like these kinds of theoretical questions is like, what are the pure models of anything? Like, what is a pure model of capitalism? I suppose you could say it was France before the revolution, but um, you know, I think that like there's a nuance that's inherent in all of these conversations. And he expresses that he's used the word nuance to describe in describing his description of socialism, and saying that it necessarily has to be nuanced because life, all
Yeah.
the confusing things, and this is developing belief system, and it hasn't really, you know I think that I don't know that he would argue this, but I have a feeling that he might say something like this, that it hasn't fully been tested as an ideology
Hmm.
yet, or as a political
Yeah.
system. Um, so I feel like he might say, like, let's hold our breath until that time comes or something before we find like a pure definition. But I like the idea that he's keeping it so capacious, that socialism can mean a few different things. It can represent a few different approaches to governance. Um, to me, it's got me thinking about democratic socialism and all these different things. But I know that that's not where you wanted to go. You had wanted to turn towards, because that's something we'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point. But I think that
Yeah.
it is interesting to think about the criticisms of capitalism.
Certainly. What did you feel were your criticisms of socialism? What are you most worried about? Moving beyond just the idea that it is untested.
Oh, I mean, I am concerned slightly about the the past kind of nationalism and really authoritarianism that came out of what we've seen from the primary models of socialism, even today when we think about Venezuela. I mean, obviously, those are not the only examples of socialism. It's much more nuanced than that. But, I do want to be cognizant of like those moral ramifications. I think that um, it's interesting to me that socialism has kind of been this idea that started off as like an economic thing and like on a macroeconomic level, but now it kind of seems like a microeconomic level, which could seem like a pivot, to say like, look, this part of socialism is not going to work. Like we got to keep with some free market engagement. Because I'm actually I support capitalism as an economic system. I believe I think free trade generally is something that is a positive thing, has been a positive thing. I just think, economies need to be regulated. One thing that he did do is he did not describe socialism as regulating, as having a regulatory state, because socialism is not having a regulatory state, um, which is an important distinction. But no, I mean, I'm concerned about those things. I'm sorry. I don't want to be whimsical, you know.
Yeah, and there it really is. It's staring you in the face. This problem that socialist countries seem to have, these problems with autocracy and corruption and poverty. And you can blame some of those things. I think Richard Wolff is absolutely right to say that capitalism has been the dominant economic system and it has hit really hard at socialism. And American foreign policy in Latin America throughout the 20th century was really invested in not allowing South America and the global South to go socialist in a lot of ways. And so, that's part of the reason why we don't have as many laboratories to experiment with what socialism could be. But to the extent that we do have socialist governments, a lot of them don't hold elections, and a lot of them have the same ruler for long periods of time. So,
I mean, there are
why do
other
we?
models like Germany is a a softer socialist model that kind of really represents that worker centric model of socialism, that newer type. And then
Mm-hmm.
there are like mixed models here and there. But I think the thing really is like, at least for me, like in terms of like putting on my public policy hat or something, it's like I think that these things were never singular concepts, and we should really not think of them as such. And any socialist regime I might envision doesn't mean socialism without capitalism. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
this is what Bernie had to fight against a lot too. He was saying, "I really just mean Sweden. I really don't mean Venezuela."
yeah, no, this is part of the nuance. And I think even if people walk away thinking, no, maybe I'm not for that kind of government system, I think we're not even at a point where we can have like a reasoned discussion, because we had to actually do, thank goodness for Richard Wolff's good publicist, and that he went on Democracy Now! And he did a debate on Reason TV, because otherwise I probably would not have found out. I would feel incomplete if my only introduction to socialism was that book. And with Jacobin, I mean, I read Jacobin. I think I'm glad I was introduced to them as a news publication, but I think that they don't explain socialism to me. It's for people who are already on board. I learned about socialism from this book.
Yeah. And you are probably a socialist more of a reform bent than a revolutionary bent, which is
Yeah.
probably kind of unusual among Jacobin readers. I would say you might be in a minority, right?
I mean, I believe it heavily in progressive policy. The kind of progressivism where we see marginal tax rates at 70% and we do whatever else, right? But no, I mean, I don't believe that the state should be, and I don't think Richard Wolff, or I don't think he believes it either, that the state should be centrally managing the economy and purely command economy systems. You know, I don't think he would argue that. I don't argue that. I think that you need market forces. Something that a government can never do is compete and innovate. It's very hard to do that. Governments are monopolies. Just categorically, it's difficult for monopoly to innovate. So you can only arguably achieve that, or at least at the rate that you see. Like you know, we're talking 12 years ago that the first iPhone came out. It's remarkable to think about the speed of that technology. I don't think a government can achieve that. The speed, maybe not the development, but
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a big dividing line in socialism, I think, kind of how hardcore you are and to what extent you believe the state should own and operate major sectors of the economy. He said these are
that's a
sometimes
good
called
point.
the commanding heights, right? Is the government, are they running the transportation sector?
Yeah,
Are they running the energy sector,
healthcare.
healthcare?
That's a
Yeah,
good. That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I
yeah.
didn't think about
These.
that. Yeah.
I mean, I have one quote, and I'm not sure if he's saying this is a particular position, but he says, if the state, quote, if the state merely regulates enterprises that otherwise remain private, owned and operated by private citizens with no position in the state apparatus, this is not socialism. Only if the state additionally owns and operates enterprises, at least within the major sectors of the economy, sometimes called the commanding heights, does socialism exist. For decades, many referred to the Soviet Union as socialist because most of its industries were dominated by state-owned and operated enterprises. In contrast, people hesitated to apply socialist to countries where state economic interventions were considerable but mostly excluded state-owned and operated enterprises. And he says a variation of this led to the split between socialist and communist.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of people that would say maybe you're not really a socialist unless the government is really taking control of these industries. But you see, you bring up monopoly, you worry about how much competition can flourish, what competition looks like. Is the government like playing a game of chess against itself where it has different industries? Does it have its pets that aren't really better, but only better because the government deems it better? How do we innovate in a socialist economy? What does that look like? Maybe it's beyond the scope of this book, but it's not something Wolf really addresses.
Well, and whatever it is, I'm sure it's through some mixed approach. I mean, I do contend that it's not. I just can't imagine, essentially managed. I mean, one example when I think of this is like, I don't want to be crude, but like using the example of Venezuela, I know that that's like the new USSR. Like everyone points that out in terms of problems with socialism, but what we saw in Venezuela and a little bit actually in Brazil, but it's not for the same reason. But Venezuela, uh, the government this had direct share ownership of the oil company, and did a lot of price fixing and different kinds of things, and quiet kickbacks, and a lot of things that uh to me like represent issues that can be avoided if the government's not directly involved in the operation or the ownership of assets for businesses. I mean, strong regulation, like when you quoted that just now, the first thing I thought of was the Affordable Care Act, because that is the purpose of the Affordable Care Act. Maybe it didn't entirely accomplish this goal, but to really regulate strongly the health insurance market. And it didn't really work out. But it's for different reasons. A lot of them are also administrative reasons, thanks to Republican states that didn't properly expand Medicaid and all that. But the point really is, um, it's like maybe I'm not a socialist. I think I am in the second form, that reformed way of thinking about like democratizing workplaces, and leveling the playing field between this employee employer paradigm. But I mean, it's certainly an interesting dimension to this, because the government ought to have, you know, the other thing about this is maybe like the Affordable Care Act is one example, but then the other example is like public authorities. When the government basically has like a contract to administer, or when has a contract with like um, water or utilities management companies. or transportation agencies. These are quasi corporations.
Hmm.
Um, which is like an interesting, so there's a lot of like gray area between like
Yeah.
command economy and capitalist economy, nuance.
Yeah. And one example that I think you mentioned of kind of the downside of a complete command economy is China with these unborn cities and zombie
Yes.
factories. I mean, they have giant empty buildings because it's not really the market that's doing these things. It's just the government making predictions about what will happen. And you know, when the economy scales back and there's not demand, they're not that nimble, and they just have these things that are these
Yeah.
places decaying.
Like I don't believe in the invisible hand or something, like, but I do think that market forces are important to recognize. Like, even like, I took like in my graduate program, I took many classes actually about like fiscal issues for public management. And a lot of the themes throughout the textbooks were like, you don't think it matters, but it matters. Like, you have to think about inflation. You have to think about the growth of your economy, as a public administrator.
Hmm.
Um, because a lot of the times questions of governance, are really questions of math, and questions of resource scarcity. These issues don't go away in a socialist regime. I think, in fact, what we saw in this book, the Richard Wolff points out that when there's resource scarcity and there are other priorities of the government just doesn't feed its people. The government just doesn't give resources to raise wages. In both cases, the USSR and in China, resources in surplus were used for
Industrialization.
industrialization and wartime preparation and things like that.
Yeah.
And that's what the government, those are questions of math, and that's why maybe the government ought not, but or maybe it should. I ultimately do think it should, but
Yeah,
just
and
an interesting
hopefully that's
dimension.
not a fundamental indictment of socialism. That's a
Yeah,
fundamental indictment of Stalin and Mao as
that's a good way of
people
putting
with
it.
priorities,
Yeah,
people with
that's a
bad
good way of
priorities,
putting
I
it.
would say. Yeah.
I agree.
Um, I wanted to, you brought it up more than once, and it really is the fundamental contribution that Richard Wolff brings. He kind of views it like the cherry on top that socialism never addressed. The reason things are going to be different this time is that new worker workplaces. I don't. There's an expression he uses, but the employer employee relationship will be fundamentally different because of employee co-ops, where it's a democratized workplace and everyone has their say. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, no, I'm honestly really compelled by that. Um, the model I think of, um, is like employee owned, or businesses
Hmm.
where there are like s- uh, you know I forget what the term is called. But profit sharing. Where there are things like profit sharing. And there's these really kind of like co-opt or communal models for thinking about the workplace. Um, you know and I think it's a really interesting thing because it avoids a lot of these tougher questions. Like, the previous book raised all these questions that actually raised more questions about, like, eliminating private property, and like,
Hmm.
you don't you don't actually have to address any of those like tougher, more technical questions if you just think about, like, you know shared leadership, or making sure that at treating a workplace like a democracy. The people at every part in that workplace ought to be heard. Unfortunately, our democracy needs to learn that lesson. But, you know, at least theoretically, and I think it's a really important way that's, um, kind of like a synthesis of lessons from previous iterations of socialism and the labor rights movement. I think the biggest failure, from what I've heard from people from Jacobin in talking about, the failures of the labor movement and all that, in terms of like spreading unionization, uh, was because socialists and labor advocates didn't do a good job at talking about how socialism is the unifying theory of addressing all these problems of income scarcity and resource scarcity. People just kind of feeling, um,
Disenfranchised.
disenfranchised. I don't want to be dramatic, but like,
Hmm.
like wage slaves.
Yeah.
I think that that's like a big feeling. People are not happy in that current model. There was one scholar I thought of, I think of for public administration, Chris Argers, who refers to, the kind of demeaning, almost, treating individuals like children that comes along with the. He didn't. Chris Argers is not saying this, but I'm interpolating his work to say this. That the employer-employee model is kind of like childlike and thinking that adults ought not advocate for themselves and don't have any power to be proportionately benefited from the profit of a company. I think that one thing that makes capitalism such a ugly thing today is that we spoke in another podcast, but about oligarchy, or not oligarchy, oligopoly,
Yeah.
and how it's really easy for me to say like democratize the workplace because most employers are large corporations. So they're the ones benefiting anyway. They're the reasons that there's this income disparity. I think maybe it might be different when there's a whole bunch of mom and pop shops. I might rethink the democratic workplace, but probably not. I think that there's reasonable opportunities for entrepreneurs to benefit the without people suffering or being disenfranchised.
Yeah, I'm very excited about the model. I think that having an investment in the future of the company, um, almost like an employee stock ownership program, but I guess it would be more like that, but a more extreme version of that, where people just have a really direct economic interest in seeing their business succeed. I could imagine that being really motivating. I could imagine it being more fair if you can decide together as a group what percentage of our revenue is going to go into our pockets and what percentage is going into reinvestment. I'd like to see those few companies. I think there are a few companies that try versions of this. I'd like to see how they do in head-to-head competitions because there's this model under capitalism that you have these genius visionaries, these Steve Jobs, these Jeff Bezoses, who make hard, unintuitive decisions, and they're able to make them because they are the leader and it's their idea, and they are the better for it. And that if you had one of the issues I could imagine is if you have just like voting a couple times a year, you wouldn't have the same sort of focused strategy that an individual might have. An individual might be laying out a 5-point plan from year to year, but people voting, they all have different interests. You've suddenly hired a software department and they have a different culture and a different direction for the company than the original crew of people, and it could get really messy. The janitors have as much say as the software specialists, and maybe they just have completely different competing visions. I could see that being messy, but it's kind of an empirical question, and I think it's one we can hopefully answer as we see more of these kind of models appear.
Yeah, so I mean, I think just in terms of like thinking about models, there's a concept called a social enterprise, and these are essentially, at least I'll say you know superficially or facially, they're companies. They focus on cash flow. They want to make sure that they're productive. They want to make sure that they have enough revenue coming in. Frankly, they want to make sure that they're profiting. But what the social enterprise does is it does, something philanthropic with the profits, or something creative in terms of making sure that its people, like its employees, are cared for. So there are social enterprises that donate, um, you know, all the profits to local nonprofits. There are some that take, do in-kind donations. If it's a restaurant, they'll like take food and make sure that they donate food, and then however much money that food is worth, they donate that amount of money to another nonprofit. There are like really creative examples, and it's something it's really becoming researched for like public administration and nonprofit management. But social enterprises represent a promising model in thinking about this kind of democratic workplace without having to like change any rules. They're kind of playing under the same rules and trying interesting things and trying democratic things. But just in terms of like the power sharing, I think Um, you know, I think that it's an empirical question, absolutely. And it's also a question, not to be coy, but like a question of politics and making sure that, there is shared leadership, um, and that people are conscious about those models for collaborative work. Um, and, I think that you can navigate those issues. I think over time people can navigate those issues. Um, and it probably is a lot of what people want, out of their employment. I think it answers some really interesting questions. Something that makes me very sad as an American is thinking about the number of sad Americans and the number of people who really feel beaten up by the system. Some people more literally than others. Um, but so it really is interesting, answering a lot of interesting challenges in a very creative way that doesn't that almost seems to uh, bypass those traditional concerns about socialist models.
Yes, I was thinking first and foremost the concern about social mobility, the idea that under socialism you will be assigned a job and then just kind of like left to rot there as a farmer or a bureaucrat. There's no real room for an advancement unless somebody dies. Hopefully, if you are invested in the success of your business and you can vote at quarterly meetings and you feel like your wise votes in distributing revenues or deciding the direction of the company can serve you and lead you towards greater prosperity. Um, and we talk a lot on a more macro level about kind of civic engagement and feeling like connected to American citizenship or the political process and institutions. This kind of democratic view of the workplace can do that, and it's much easier to do on a smaller scale, where it's especially smaller companies, but even a larger corporation. Um, Hopefully, it's a path forward for people to provide them with meaning and the opportunity for social advancement.
Well, an interesting part of this too is that it's not necessarily just about work too. Like a lot of this democratization is going to have to do with how companies and how companies can use technology to make people's jobs easier, and how companies can structure the workplace to make things feel less like a drag, um, and to improve not just kind of like in a productive sense, but really in like a qualitative, sense, addressing people's needs, um, you know, being able to do that. Like that particular thing is interesting because I feel like this is something that I heard even when I took philosophy like years and years and years ago. I remember hearing someone say something about how Marx said that if we just something to the effect of if we just get good at technology, people will have to work less and all that good stuff. And now we've gotten to a point where people are concerned that technology is going to take their jobs, and it's because people's lives and their livelihoods are so defined by their employment. So this democratic model of socialism really redefines that relationship to work, um, and makes work work for you, not just you work for work. Um,
You should be socialism spokesperson.
yeah, I put in my application. But yeah, no, I mean, I really am. I do think I am persuaded. I think I think I've changed a lot about how I think, especially about democratic socialism. Um, so it's an interesting thing. I'm still not quite. I don't know. I'm pretty there. I'm pretty there. I think I'm pretty there.
I like that it's really given me a sense of historical narrative. I really appreciate
Yeah.
that about history, and that there's the idea that there's this kind of fundamental models that have governed how the world has worked, and there's this kind of like dyadic thing always between like the top and the lower, and that's really what Marx's fundamental insight. Maybe this was the moment you felt that it was unclear. This is a quote: "The basic lesson drawn by socialists from the past transitions between economic systems was captured in Marx's succinct phrase: the history of all hitherto struggles is the history of class struggles, slavery, feudalism, monarchy, capital." That's unquote. But all the past economic systems have shared this, And really, the quality of your society and the quality of your economic system are reflected in the class struggles and the extent to which people are respected and valued and have reasonable standards of living.
Yeah. Well, and how do you address those class struggles without maybe like democratizing the workplace and changing the balance of power in politics and things like that? I've always been fascinated since I started reading these about socialism, about this fixation on class struggle, and um, it's something that I used to try to kind of like not talk about class that much because it left a bad taste in my mouth and it kind of starts to sound elitist. Um, but I think that this really opened me up to thinking about class for what it really means, which is kind of like a catch-all for just people in society. I don't think it's dichotomous though, like there's some proletariat and bourgeoisie. But I think that there's definitely like a working class. That much we know, that there's a
Hmm.
working class, and that working class, really hasn't gotten the respect it deserves. I think something that always fascinates me. Now I'm like a bigwig, I'm like whatever, professional guy. But like just a few years ago, I was like taking out trash, and I used to have trash fall on my body and like be soaked and drenched old
Oh
like
God.
food, uneaten
Yeah.
food for $9 an hour. I did this for $9 an hour and I worked 60 hours a week and it was thankless. And now I get paid much more than that. And, you know, my workload has gotten considerably different, I'll say. And I'm thanked.
Yeah.
But those are but I'll never forget those days. And I hope people who succeed, who move on and who do become economically mobile don't forget that, because I think that that's part of the drive for me as kind of a progressive person now, maybe as a socialist, and thinking about like how is a person who works their butt off very hard, people who work their butts off very hard, getting paid $9 an hour in a kitchen, $8 an hour. Meanwhile, people are making like hecka money. Um, you know,
Yeah.
it's
Well, you're
interesting.
you're very lucky. Yeah, and you're one of the rare people who's able to have that kind of
That's the other
social
thing that, yeah,
mobility.
it's
That's
unfortunate.
that's the critical point.
Yeah.
Everybody, equality of opportunity is really necessary, and canceling the effects of bad luck is really what any economic system aims to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, I absolutely agree. And this economic system, I think in despite the positive implications, I still am compelled by like the claim that like, quality of life has increased like so much just in the last like 150 years in a capitalist system. I'm compelled by all of that.
the
Excuse me.
Steven Pinker data, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you hear these things from the libertarians as well. I mean, I'm someone, I play around with Cato Institute. But at the end of the day, like it's clear, among many things that are clear in society, but it is clear that our capitalist system has failed us as it is, and that there have been attempts in the kind of neoliberal vein of doing things like quantitative easing. And well, I kind of agree with quantitative easing, but like the bank bailouts and like the Dodd-Frank Act and like the Affordable Care Act, all these things that really just try to like say, hey, look guys, can you work with us a little bit, like the capitalist system, markets, can you work with us a little bit? It turns out that they cannot work with us, and they seem to just somehow get benefited every time. Um, these companies. We need to change that. Like we're in a situation where like how many more statistics do we need to go through before we realize like things that are going on now are not working? And like it's not the analogy I have for it is like it's like a sinking boat, and there's just like all these different holes that keep coming. No one has enough fingers, to plug the holes. Like we need to just lay down a new foundation and plug a lot of holes at once.
Yeah, I appreciate that metaphor, and I
I
appreciate that
hope,
dialogue.
I thought it was pretty good, I gotta say.
I
It was
do
tough for
like
me.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a funny one too, because if you think about it, but yeah, no, it was tough for me to think of a good metaphor to describe it, because you've raised this point before, but just about how, there's a lot of unknown. And it's definitely valid. Like this is, what is it, like the evil that you know? I don't know.
Yeah,
But
the devil that you know is worse than is better than the devil that you don't know.
Something like that. But like, we
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, I'm pretty confident, but like I take you at your I take your point, and I think being reasonable, like we all have to think about like what can we just do here to like tweak this machine a little bit. I think that it's a philosophical conclusion about how much you want to scrap the system and how radical you want to be. I am more radical. Um, Others might be less radical, and that's perfectly fine. These are philosophical conversations at the end of the
Yeah.
day. Well,
But the
except
point
for
of
the moral need to improve people's lives. That is not a philosophical conversation. That is an ethical conversation and a political one. But
um, what if you're like Thanos or something? Like his philosophy is different. You got to just like snap people out of existence. I don't know. Maybe he's reducing suffering that way, but I'm
yeah, I
not.
mean,
I'm not a.
maybe
Go
he's
ahead.
maximizing human flourishing, as
Yeah.
as a friend of yours likes to say. Uh, but yeah, no, I mean, this was a great book. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interesting questions that I still have, and I'm interested in learning about more about socialism. Really seeing some of the more contemporary models.
Yeah, and I see why he's written a book about work too. Maybe we'll pursue looking at that.
He's got like a
But
whole
I appreciate it.
organization, Democracy in Action. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he does podcasts and stuff. He's a busy guy. Um, it's interesting that no, I thought that joke before I read his book, but I'm still gonna make it. It's funny that we bought his book from him, and he's got a publisher and he's the owner of a book. It doesn't sound very socialistic to me, but um,
I
that
was
joke's no
thinking that
longer
when you
funny.
said I was thinking about that when you said how much you've advanced and how much you're doing great under capitalism. What do you have to complain about?
Yeah, yeah, no. Well, I mean, I'm glad you pointed this out, though. That I am, I work hard and all that stuff, but like, it's just unfortunate that I'm one. It doesn't have. I'm not the story of American education. The story of American education is like you get your degree, and it's really hard to find gainful employment. Not even just what's in your heart, but gainful employment.
Hmm.
That's a negative situation.
Certainly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think let's wrap this up. I enjoyed the dialogue. I enjoyed the book.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book. We're 45 minutes in, so we're doing pretty well, actually. Do you want to maybe talk about, I know you wanted to talk about the failures of capitalism. I know we did a little bit, but did you want to go more into that, or do you want to just cut it off?
Um,
Because we don't, I mean, I
I
actually think we pretty well summarized.
yeah, I don't
Obviously,
think
there's
I
a lot
have a
to go
ton
into.
of yeah, I don't think I have a ton of points left unsaid. It's a short enough book, and like I said, it has some kind of like a
Yeah.
greatest hits thing where it hits you with these themes, and I think I'm happy there. I think shorter is better.
Yeah, no, we just encourage you to check out the book. It's a really good description of socialism, and um, yeah, there it is displayed
Is the
there.
ebook version
His screen is nicer than mine, so I won't do you guys the disservice of showing
the
you my screen,
disservice?
or guys and gals. But yeah, it was a really good book. It was really, even if you don't, even if you're not interested in socialism, or willing to be persuaded by the idea, it's important to learn about. If we're all being sincere and philosophical, and the point of this really is to be sincere and philosophical, just learn about it in a sober way. It's hard to do that, but if you find a book like this one, I encourage you to do some good reading. And you've mentioned a few other books, and you sent me a few others, so it's not as if it's only Richard Wolff, but just
Yeah.
it's fewer and further between than we'd like.
Yeah, it's not a debate that's really being had.
Yeah,
Is part of what point, and intentional suppression has been a real factor in scarring the ability of public intellectuals and really the general public to learn about these topics.
yeah,
So I think it does behoove us to at least have the conversation.
yeah, absolutely. And check us out for our next discussion. Not quite sure what it'll be yet, but we'll think of something. And we do have a book club, so we are going to continue the book club. I don't know if we've decided on it, but definitely stay a part of it. But I will show everyone what I want it to be. Um,
I
and
think
I
we
encourage
decided on
everyone
that.
to.
I bought that book.
This
Yeah.
is our next book. You bought it.
Yeah,
Yeah, this
I
is our
did.
next book, everyone. You should buy this book. It's a very interesting concept. The bond market has a very strong influence on our administrative structure and our budgetary policy. And it matters more than it sounds boring, and it is boring, but it matters. And uh, maybe even for socialism a little bit too. But yeah, so thank you all for listening in, and have great days, nights, whatever part of the day it is where you are.